Hey guys, Amish John here. Next weekend, November 17th and 18th, I will be in Minnesota with the Amish, former Amish, Mennonite communities, and just anyone who wants to join the celebration with us as we host our Fun for the Shunned Amish Gospel Party. So any of you who have been excommunicated, disfellowshipped, ostracized, or just want to be, we are going to enjoy our apostasy from dead religion together. It's not too late to join us. It's free. Visit thenewmystics.com/Amish. Guys, each month we do a live full-length web broadcast online called The Inner Sanctum, which is a members-only type show where we have real Q&A. It's live. Our members have access to dozens and dozens of hours of archived shows. And you can find it at thenewmystics.tv. It's kind of a web church type thing, except nobody really considers it worthy of their tithe. So I need to work on that. But anyways, my point in mentioning this is that lately on the Inner Sanctum, we've been going through the whole book that our Honorable Orange Executive in the Oval Office calls 1 Corinthians. And in 1 Corinthians 5, the Apostle Paul tells us quite plainly to expel the immoral brother. And so in light of our Fun for the Shunned Amish event, I mean, the only thing half as fun as raising a barn and grinding your own cornmeal is getting to the nitty-gritty of excommunicating somebody for wearing buttons or using an electric toaster. The topic of excommunication is a very tricky one because it is, in fact, a New Testament concept heralded by the grace apostle himself. And yet it's employed in such a hellish way to tear apart families and destroy otherwise healthy relationships. Because the concept, instead of promoting healthy community, most usually gets hijacked by cloistered sects and cults and legalistic churches to oust anyone who questions their non-gracious doctrines or who just can't toe the line of their pointless legalisms. Many cloistered communities whose glue and mortar is not the love of God in Christ Jesus, but rather an arbitrary set of rules, regulations, or oddball doctrines that serve as a vain attempt to generate a form of spirituality, but so often are just forms of godliness that deny the power thereof. Look, I fully agree that the gospel calls us out to be separate from the world, but remember that the word Pharisee also means separatist. And part of what differentiates us is a ravenous, unconditional love of sinners and relentless mercy and forgiveness in a culture that demands blood. Instead of calling for the crucifixion of disgraced politicians and Hollywood sex offenders and cheating sports stars, while CNN wants a public execution, we Christians should be the ones extending the love of Christ to even the bottom dregs of the barrel of society's outcasts. We don't hop on the bandwagon of societal outrage. We don't make outcasts, we embrace them. Our separation is from the corrupted spirit of the world, which includes such hatred. It's not a separation from humanity itself. As light and salt of the world, we should be known for our love. But this begs the question, is there a place for actual excommunication? Because this is where I need to get honest with you here. This is one reason why people who get abused end up getting abused over and over throughout their lives very often. Often there's an overreaction against the control of the first abuser. And instead of setting up boundaries for yourself, you do just the opposite. You wrongly associate any boundaries at all with that control, and you set yourself up for failure. And not at all saying it's your fault for being abused, but we unnecessarily open ourselves to it by not having healthy parameters. I mean, why do you think sexual abuse and cults go hand in hand? It's a vicious cycle of manipulation. So some people, they come out of religion and they say, well, I'm not going to be like those religious controllers. And then they just end up being a yes man to everything. And then they just get run over in the end. And so there is a very real need at times for kicking people out the door who are being toxic and hurting the community. Let's see what Paul has to say here, okay? Now, just for fun, let me read the Message translation of 1 Corinthians 5, 9 through 13. In context, the Corinthian church was actually bragging about a dude in their midst who was shagging his own stepmom. Paul says, I wrote you in my earlier letter that you shouldn't make yourselves at home among the sexually promiscuous. I didn't mean that you should have nothing at all to do with outsiders of that sort, or with crooks, whether blue or white collar, or with spiritual phonies for that matter. You'd have to leave the world entirely to do that. But I am saying that you shouldn't act as if everything is just fine when a friend who claims to be a Christian is promiscuous or crooked, is flipped with God or rude to friends, gets drunk or becomes greedy and predatory. You can't just go along with this, treating it as acceptable behavior. I'm not responsible for what the outsiders do, but don't we have some responsibility for those within our community of believers? God decides on the outsiders, but we need to decide when our brothers and sisters are out of line and, if necessary, clean house. Now look, this is a topic we don't like to talk about in more organic fellowships or the so-called grace camp, because a lot of people we know have been excommunicated themselves for all the wrong reasons. Excommunicating a Christian from a local assembly, whether justified or not, is a traumatic and horrible experience, to say the least. You see, a lot of people gravitate toward home groups or more organic forms of church, or bail out on fellowship altogether for the very reason that they have had negative experiences with the institutional ones. Sometimes the institutional churches were dysfunctional or had a heavy-handed hierarchical control. But other times that's not the case. The person was actually booted from the church because of some serious unrepentant sin that threatened the health of the community or had a pattern of causing division. So this is not an easy black and white issue. And it is flippant and immature to think that all excommunication itself is always wrong. But let me say this about it, okay? Let me say what excommunication is not. You are not cutting people off from God's grace. You're just getting them out of your space. It's like blocking people on Facebook. You're free to do whatever you want on your own page, but you can't expect to vomit all over mine. It's about having safe space. I mean, for some of you, you don't like the idea of community anymore precisely because it was not a safe space. If you don't learn boundaries with people, you're going to get run over and abused your whole life unnecessarily. And how much more true is this in community? It is discussed several places in the New Testament, so we can't just easily ignore the issue. Besides here, also you have Matthew 18, where Jesus says, if your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault, just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you've won them over. But if they will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. And then also Romans 16:17. Paul says, I urge you, brothers and sisters, to watch out for those who cause divisions and put obstacles in your way that are contrary to the teaching you've learned. Keep away from them. Now for starters, treating someone like a pagan or tax collector. Keep in mind that Jesus treats pagans and tax collectors quite lovingly. He dies for them. So while there is a degree of disassociation involved relationally so as not to get ensnared or to endorse their bad behavior or divisiveness, the impetus is more to view them the way you would an unbeliever. In other words, not somebody you should look up to and drink from in all matters of doctrine or ethics. Okay, there's a bit of a boundary put up here. All our relationships have varying degrees of boundaries. But that doesn't mean absence of love. Not everybody I meet gets to sleep in my house, much less in my bedroom with me and my wife. Boundaries are healthy in general. And most specifically, Paul is talking about a boundary in the assembly or gathering of believers. He's crystal clear that you should associate with pagan worldly sinners in this chapter. But when someone is a Christian that should know better, in terms of the corporate community behavior, it needs to be articulated that certain crap just doesn't fly. Yes, bring in the prostitutes, bring in the drug addicts, etc. But as Christians, with people who know better, who can bring others down with them by justifying such behavior as if it's all kosher, well look, let them go do their whoring and freebasing at the crack house, not openly in our family circle whose whole rhythm is the beauty of holiness. Now look, it helps if you take all the weird spiritual paranoia out of the equation, like being afraid of their demons or calling them unclean or some nonsense like that. Sometimes there's just a healthy distancing that's needed in certain relationships. On a practical level, how many times have you had a friend and then you realize, whoa, this guy is mental, and the relationship was more toxic than you realized? But instead of, having to have some big soap opera drama clean break where you tell him he's not your friend anymore, you just gradually add more distance. You don't call as much. You don't text every day. There's no love lost. You just realize, again, this isn't the healthiest relationship. Well, look, on a bigger scale, this same thing at times needs to happen in communities. And there are rare occasions where something reaches a tragic climax and needs to be openly addressed about an individual. But it gets resolved more organically through individual relationships. So this stuff doesn't always have to come to a big, massive, formal head where they're kicked to the curb. Okay? It's only the rare, real stubborn, hard-headed person who's adamant about maintaining horrible behavior that's harmful to the group. That's what we're dealing with here. Not just your average Joe who has trouble in an area but he wants to work it out. And this is by no means something that should occur flippantly or haphazardly. You should never say some ridiculous thing like that person's going to hell or never talk to them again. It's just common sense stuff, guys. If somebody keeps coming over to my house for a party and ruins it every time, the invitation will no longer be extended. The person is loved, included by God, but there is a place called outside the party, and sometimes some distance needs to be put in relationships, including corporate ones, where you have to love them from a distance. But since we're rolling on this, let me tell you what I do not espouse. I am not advocating a systematic, formal process of shunning where there are these strict lists of arbitrary infractions that automatically get you booted. And like you see in so many cults where you can't even talk to your family anymore, some stupid thing like that. And see, the line blurs. And you start dictating the length of skirts because a short skirt is paramount to fornication and hair cutting patterns and the required hours of speaking in tongues each day or whatever. And anytime there is a legitimate need to address authentically harmful behavior, it must be worked out relationally, worked out on a case-by-case basis, not just arbitrarily based on them not ticking a certain box on the rule list, because these are real people and every situation is different. And the aim is to heal and restore the person, not just restore some ideological idea of church order. There's not just this legalistic protocol we follow here. We're dealing with real people and real families, and primarily unrepentant sexual immorality is the biggest problem that leads to this in most cases, as it was in Paul's day. You can't give room to homewreckers and predators. And when I say unrepentant, that means you're still trying to justify it versus expressing some remorse. See, these guys in Corinth were actually proud. There was no remorse. Man, you're tapping your own mom? That's amazing. Look how cutting edge you are. And I mean, you see a lot of that today. Look at me, how unreligious I am, boasting in ridiculous behavior or certain unbiblical sexual aberrations as if God endorses it. There's no remorse or acknowledging the wrongdoing of certain things. I'm not saying be depressed and feel guilty and unforgiven over it, but there needs to be some remorse over sinful actions because it begins with a metanoia, change of mind, to recognize something is ungracious behavior. It's like, oh, that was stupid, that sucks, but let's move on, let's not do that anymore. And then, look, the action needs to be stopped. Stop sleeping with mommy. Now, if this is some deep-seated behavioral thing or you need some counseling to work through some stuff. Maybe you've got some unbiblical sexual tendencies or something because you were abused. We don't just go kicking everybody out of the boat. Love is the rhythm of this whole thing. But love doesn't endorse your sin. It wants you free from it. And it doesn't want other innocents infected by it. Okay, look, there should be abundant time to love and work through issues. But the question is, are you working through it? Can you acknowledge that it's wrong? Is there remorse over it? Or are you just still trying to justify it? And I know that that justification game can be a day-to-day issue where you come up with a new excuse every time you do it, and then acknowledge it's wrong and cry, and then you go justify it and do it again. And I know this seamlessly endless cycle. And there needs to be forgiveness 70 times 7. But the issue, I think, is when you flip and can no longer have that conviction and sensitivity to recognize something is wrong. And suddenly you're flying your rainbow flags all over Facebook and boasting in the immorality as if it's a good thing, as if it's your true identity. And it's not. You're a Christian, but have forgotten your true identity. And so you go back trying to live by this sinful nature that's not even a real thing. Look, again, this is such a complex issue because if you're going to pick certain things that are excommunicable offenses, well, how deep does it go? How deep are you going to push it? We don't go scrutinizing every individual thing here. But for instance, one of the disfellowshipping offenses here in 1 Corinthians 5 is covetousness. I mean, what would happen if we kicked every jealous person out of the church? Well, that's clearly not Paul's intent. But there are situations, say when someone is jealous of church leadership and tries to split the church. That's really what he's talking about. And he mentions this off of the back of a big diatribe on divisions that he's talking about over the last couple chapters. As a matter of fact, the verse we just read from Romans 16, we're actually told not really to stay away from sinners themselves, but specifically those who are causing divisions or putting stumbling blocks that are contrary to the teachings you've heard. Now look, preaching the gospel of grace, well, that causes some division. I mean, I've had people not want me to come to their church because the gospel would cause division. Man, you need to take a big axe to that thing. Look, grace wants reform and it wants people liberated. The unholy division is when you attack someone for believing in the grace of Jesus Christ. Versus the futility of legalism that you're trying to hold on to. The legalists are the unholy divisive ones. They're the ones putting stumbling blocks that are contrary to the teachings we've heard from the apostles. Now, to toss somebody from a local assembly, again, can be one of the most heart-wrenching, dreadful things that can happen in a person's life. And if you even have one slightest ounce of compassion, actually having to excommunicate somebody should be one of the most horrendous things you've ever had to do. But any type of church structure you have, whether home group or megachurch, this will inevitably be something you are faced with at some point. There are just going to be rare occasions of someone in caustic, unrepentant sin. And it's pretty much just the stuff Paul mentions in the next chapter in 1 Corinthians 6. That if you persist in it, the problem gets ignored, the entire group is going to get a nasty yeast infection because a little leaven leavens the whole lump. Look, keep in mind, in a healthy church group, an excommunication should be a very, very, very rare thing. Again, if a person is toxic, to use that word again, then it's not just the one person who approaches them, or then the 2 or 3 that approach them before they're brought before the community and extradited, but in fact, the 2 or 3 approach to this person maybe several times in several different ways to work out the problem, maybe is the most gracious option here. I mean, if you are incredibly patient and desperately want to see the person repent, then it could be a period of months or whatever. You would want the same kind of patience extended towards you. If you were the offender, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But as you know, these days, with churches on every other block, somebody gets excommunicated and then they just bounce to another place the next week. You know, in the old days, they used to have these letters of recommendation from their old church that they would bring to their new one. Now, I know that sounds crazy and out of date these days with pop-up churches everywhere trying to steal whatever sheep they can get from the neighboring flock. But that was actually an ancient custom, these letters of recommendation. You know, the Baptists are still big on having your letter of membership, by the way. I am still technically a letter-holding member in good standing of a Southern Baptist church in Georgia where I got baptized over 20 years ago and only went there for a couple of weeks. So as a Baptist, you've got eternal security, so they're not going to tear up my letter anytime unless I ask them to. Yes, I am Southern Baptist. But hey, in all seriousness, the whole letter thing is basically to let other churches know that you weren't banging a Sunday school teacher and then just skipped town when they called you on the carpet. But the whole concept of letters of recommendation is actually biblical and was a practice in the New Testament era. Now, I'm not saying we should reinstitute it. That's a lost cause. But look, your letter in those days would have gone ahead of you, informing the local church whether or not you had a good or bad report. So it's interesting, at least. Again, I know it's not normal practice, especially in more organic or home group type churches. It seems too formal and stuffy, but it actually was a biblical practice with some good practical wisdom that could save a lot of headache and prevent a lot of repeat nightmares. It's important to remember that someone can be disfellowshipped for right reasons or wrong reasons. That is what makes this so tricky. I think it's important to remember that shunning or not shunning isn't the issue. The grace of the gospel is the issue. It's not just a matter of coming out of religion, but coming into the grace of the gospel. You could get kicked out for good reasons or bad reasons that have nothing to do with the gospel. Look, let's ditch religion, yes, but the point is to get jacked up on grace and live as gracious people in gracious community. If you've been shunned for believing in grace, I don't mean sleeping with a church secretary, but preaching new creation realities. Guys, here are a few notable people who were excommunicated from their communities. Jesus Christ, the Apostle Paul. Recently, my wife, she was bounced from a local church down the street a couple years back for being married to me. That was the only reason. Look, if you are Amish, you can be excommunicated for reading an English Bible or owning a powered lawnmower. I have some former Jehovah's Witness friends who were disfellowshipped because they started to realize the whole thing was a sham. We've known many people who've been excommunicated for believing the gospel. I mean, sometimes there's an unholy alliance masquerading as the church that kicks out the real members. So a vast majority of excommunications are wrong and totally arbitrary. But if it's happened to you before, don't just get bitter and think there's never any place for it. Sometimes an excommunicated person is bad-mouthing their former church, complaining of being mistreated. But if you actually talk to the church, you might hear another side of the story that this person's spinning. The guy ran off with the bank account or was a pedophile or whatever. So there are cases where it's been appropriate and cases where it's been inappropriate. I know we want easy answers, a yes or no, but there's just no hard, fast rule. Man, we love rules, but it's always a relational issue, and it's always a heavy-hearted thing that stirs up a lot of emotion if it reaches that point. Look, sometimes people excommunicate because they're just mean. And sometimes people should be excommunicated, but they aren't because the pastor has no cojones. And let's just throw the religious people a bone for a minute, okay? Sometimes it helps us to forgive bad leadership and avoid that bitterness thing if we actually step into their shoes for a minute. Now here, I'm talking about if they kick you out for something they shouldn't have. Okay, now you are always going to think they shouldn't have. I mean, if you're a prisoner, you're always not guilty, right? But let's say they kicked you out for a good thing, like not believing in penal substitution or something, all right? There's an example. Many times, these guys genuinely do love people, and they're just doing the best they know how. They don't know better, and they're just working within their existing paradigm of revelation, and they think you're going to hurt somebody, even though you may be doing something amazing, like teaching grace. And as ridiculous as it is, we should at least know their heart is sometimes in the right place, even if they are clueless. So guys, just shake the dust off your feet and move on. Shaking off the dust doesn't mean judgment be on your heads, you reprobates. No, shaking the dust means shaking off the bitterness and moving on with life. And look, at other times, which is actually quite often, the act of excommunication is not a loving one. Leadership is just busy and calculated and cold and inconvenienced by a person's issues, and they don't take the time to get the person healed. They don't want to deal with any mess, so they just press the abort button. I think at the end of the day, we are always safest when love is our ultimate motivator, because love really does win. Love loves the offender, but it also protects the vulnerable. And if love is present, these cases should be extremely rare because they are usually avoidable. Let me give you an example. You could divide every possible reason for excommunication into two basic types: action and belief. Okay? You are either doing immoral actions, 90% of the time, this usually involves money or a penis, or you are teaching heretical beliefs, passing around a John Crowder book. Okay? Now, the first type is easy to get right because the excommunicable list of immoral behaviors are not that super long. Usually you're poking around where you shouldn't with Brother Leroy's wife or something, but even here there are gray areas. We don't excommunicate every Tom who struggles with porn, but that is technically sexual immorality. But in terms of action, the more legalistic and cultic a group is, the list of excommunicable offenses grows longer. Suddenly watching Netflix and committing bestiality are equated as the very same offense. I mean, who decided Amish can't wear buttons? Or if you're caught driving a tractor instead of plowing with a mule, or somebody gets busted watching Harry Potter, or if you're an independent fundamental Baptist woman, let's say you get caught wearing pants instead of culottes, or wearing a bikini instead of a one piece. It just gets ridiculous and meticulous. But groups like this who don't have the gospel, they find their safety in regulations. So the least infraction of their rules constitutes a major offense paramount to the full-blown immorality. Okay, it's an open door to the pits of hell. But love covers a multitude of offenses. And if we are not legalistic on ridiculous minor stuff, we can usually be quite inclusive of people as long as they're not harming the body. And when it comes to the other type of excommunication, the belief issues, the doctrinal issues, passing around the John Crowder books, look, this one is usually much more tricky because people can get really confused about what to believe. Half the time, people have no idea what they believe. All of us have a little heresy in there somewhere. So this is an area that is very, very sensitive. We're all learning and maturing and thinking through things. I mean, we can't thought police everybody. And with the internet itself, there's so much exposure to varying doctrinal views out there. We can't just clamp down on everything to the point of disfellowshipping people we disagree with. I mean, the internet is probably a big reason why so many people are not in church anymore. They're exposed to so many new ideas, not just bad ones, but good ones. And we don't know how to fit in those old boxes. This is such a huge topic. But it's important to address because we need unity in the body of Christ. I would love to see communion between Orthodox, Catholic, the Methodist, the Pentecostal, the Evangelical. They believe so radically different in so many areas. They're constantly labeling one another as the whore of Babylon. And yet, as Rick Joyner used to say, we have denominations for a reason, because without them, certain unique truths would not be preserved. We may just become this amalgam of people who lose important aspects of the faith. We are all learning and growing together, and we need to be able to process ideas in community. And maybe this is an area that I'm quite liberal and perhaps too charitable in, but if we can agree on the lordship of Jesus Christ, and by lordship I don't mean the Mormon version, I mean he really is God and really is man, then at least on my end I consider you in communion with me. You are a brother. I may not go to your church because you got a lot of other crap mixed into the blender as well, but we are family. And in a community group setting, the issue where heresy becomes a potential disfellowshipping offense is when you become a pusher. A lot of it really seems to be more about the division here than the actual content. You're a schismatic. But even then, the gospel itself causes division. Again, a healthy division. So this one is so tricky. And no wonder we don't have all this figured out. They're not easy answers. And that's why we have 15 trillion denominations and splits and splinters, and even the splinters are split. So I don't have any easy answers except that Jesus is the answer, and in Him we are already united. So let's start acting like it as much as possible. But in the local church level, when you become a pusher, if you're going around trying to convince people of some weird trip that you're on, I mean, Jesus was an alien from Melmac, for example, which you just refuse to keep to yourself. And because leaders do have a role of leadership in a local community, they have a responsibility to address things and not see their flock turn into an Alf cult. And they have the right to say, look, you're free to believe whatever, but please don't go around spreading those ideas in this platform. So there's an issue of airspace here. The gospel brings enough division. We don't need to go around causing unnecessary division with our pet doctrines and our side issues that are way down the ladder of priority. Now, it is fine to find another group or a church with whom your beliefs align more closely. But I never tell people to go leave their church, and I definitely never tell people to split their church. I'd rather the gospel get through to people relationally through you in your church by loving them, rather than you standing up and nailing mystical union to the front door like 95 Theses and telling the congregation at the top of your lungs on Sunday morning that the pastor's the Antichrist. Before you go kicking someone out over a doctrinal issue, if you're really motivated by love, then you're willing to sit down and search the scriptures together. And if the potential heretic is actually right, and leadership is loving enough to be open and work through some discussions, then hopefully excommunication is the last option on the agenda. And if the person is right, then hopefully leadership is sensitive enough to Holy Spirit to be willing at least to keep the matter in the tension of mystery while staying in relation together. And if the guy is wrong, then hopefully he's teachable and humble enough to recognize it. And at minimum, if he's willing to keep his thoughts on it private without crusading it in the local body, he's willing to jive with the vibe of that body, then he should be allowed to stay. But let's not be so arrogant as to think the whole church has to believe exactly like us, even if we're convinced that we're right. There are priorities here. Pick your battles and weigh in on your priorities. But if this person feels his ideas are important enough that he has to spread them in the local church, or else he's compromising his belief, then why even wait to be excommunicated? If you're not received, find another church. If you demand to push your ideas, good or bad, and leadership feels those ideas are just too off base in their opinion and will cause too much trouble in their opinion, they're free to ask you to leave. It's their club. I'm not saying they're in the right. Quite often they're not. Mother Church has left her own long, bloody trail of martyrs. But again, this is so tricky, because there are 50 shades of gray here in terms of how far do you get down the rabbit hole of heresy before you actually need to be booted. And I mean real heresy. I would say for the most part, excommunication as a last resort should only apply to someone who is already in a degree of leadership or is presenting themselves as a teacher and is leading people astray and is unwilling to change his mind. If you're just some average guy in the pew who thinks Jesus is from Saturn, well, unfortunately, most of the church already believes worse stuff about God than that. So we need to excommunicate everybody by that thinking, okay? Look, let me finish by saying, if you've been kicked out of a place for good or bad reasons, or maybe a little bit of both, you don't need to be tormented in a cycle of trying to figure it all out. Who was right? Who was wrong? Look, maybe nobody handled things properly. Maybe you're a leader who's even bounced somebody for the wrong reasons. There is grace for you. Just know that you are unconditionally loved by your Father, that Jesus entered the brokenness of your situation, and Holy Spirit is restoring you to a wholeness that God is unrelentingly convinced is already yours. There is healthy body life for you. There are good shepherds. He does not expect you to live this life on your own. And there is a humility and a teachability that he's giving all of us to be willing to acknowledge, learn from our mistakes and the mistakes of others, to be patient with others. And there's no obligation on you toward legalism and control. No obligation except the obligation of love. And guys, before you go, I want to tell you about a last minute opportunity that we just put out here at Sons of Thunder this week. Okay, people are always wanting to join me on the road for an internship, and I was not planning on doing another one until May 2019. But I realized there's this window of opportunity to do one early next year when I'm in Europe. At the end of January, beginning of February 2018, we have an internship like none that we've ever done before, where you would travel with me to 11 countries throughout Europe over 12 days. We'll be going to Germany, Poland, Bulgaria, Serbia, Macedonia, Kosovo, Albania, Montenegro, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Croatia, and France. Now, as you know, January is coming up quick in just a few months. So whoever comes on this will not have a lot of time to procrastinate it, okay? Plus, we can only take a handful of folks, so this will fill up. The whole thing about internships is spending time together in the message and rubbing elbows in the glory and that atmosphere of the supernatural and nonstop whack. It's all about stirring up that fullness that's already in your belly. And you get a taste of itinerant ministry, lots of one-on-one time together. It's all about impartation, okay? We literally just added this to the website. And because it's coming up fast, the sign-up window is literally just 1 month from now. You got a month to get in your cash, block the time off work, and prepare for blast off, okay? Let me also say, this is astronomically cheaper than most of our internships, because most of these countries that we'll be driving through are like on a road tour, okay? So we were able to lower the cost. It's not as many flights. Also, this will be the smallest and most intimate of all of our internships. And because this is a last minute opportunity, unlike our trips where you put in a deposit and then you have a few months to raise funds, this one you're gonna need to come up with all your cash up front by December 5th, okay? Usually our internships are about $5,000. This one is a lot cheaper, but you got to lock it in again by December 5th. So visit thenewmystics.com/intern to check it out. And also, guys, before you go, just a quick rundown of what is on the calendar. Now is a great time to book in a slot for our Hawaii marriage retreat in Maui that is coming up in February. Husbands, it is a great Christmas gift. In December, I'm in Hong Kong. In January, I have a mystical school in Charlotte, North Carolina. Also in January, we have a Poland gospel party in Warsaw. And in February, a mystical school in France. In April, I have a mystical school coming to Springfield, Illinois. And in May, we have a mystical school coming to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. In June, I have my only England event in Bristol, UK. And in August, I have a school in Ireland. Plus, a conference with Baxter Kruger and Godfrey Birtle in Scotland. The three of us will also have an exclusive gentleman's retreat on the island of Isla, Scotland. And my only event with Baxter in the USA will be in Las Vegas with Zach Wexler next fall. And this is a limited sabbatical year schedule, guys. So if you see something you fancy, lock in a spot early. You can find all this stuff at thenewmystics.com/schools.
Sons of Thunder runs on partnerships and generous contributions from people like you. If you've been blessed by the ministry and want to participate in sharing the gospel and reaching the poor with us, consider becoming a monthly supporter at thenewmystics.com/partners.